Hello, and welcome to Off the Fence, a podcast where we deconstruct difficult decision making so we can try to figure out what keeps us stuck. And more importantly, how do we get unstuck? I'm your host, Karen Covey, a former divorce lawyer, mediator, and arbitrator turned coach, author, and entrepreneur. With me today, I am thrilled to have Susan Pease Gadoua. And Susan is a therapist in the San Francisco Bay Area and the founder of the parenting marriage concept. She works with couples on the brink and runs several women's divorce support groups. She's also the author of Contemplating Divorce, a step-by-step guide to deciding whether to stay or go, and the Parenting Marriage Workbook. As a child of divorced parents, Susan knows firsthand how disruptive an unhappy marriage and subsequent marital dissolution can be. When her parents split on their 28th wedding anniversary, marriage counseling was unheard of and emotional divorce support virtually non-existent. Susan's personal experience, combined with years of working with couples in distress, both in striving to save their marriage or transition out of it, led her to become passionate about offering support to people at perhaps one of the most crucial junctures in their lives. Susan, welcome to the show.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
I am so excited. My biggest challenge in this conversation is going to be keeping it into a reasonable amount of time because I have so many questions for you. And I want to start for people who aren't familiar with the concept of parenting marriage. What is it?
Well, it is a concept where a couple who has kids, but the romantic portion of the relationship is no longer. So, according to our social mandates, if that's the case, you're supposed to get divorced. But if they have kids and they co-parent well, so everything else works except for the physical intimacy and romance, then this is a way for parents to stay together by changing their agreements and the sort of rules, if you will, of their marriage. So they can stay and co-parent, but they can also have their own separate social life.
So interesting. So I want to get into what that can look like for different people. But before we do that, how did you come up with this?
Well, like my best ideas, I didn't create it. I just sort of followed what was needed. And this happened during the Great Recession in the mid 2000s, where people's portfolios were down, their houses were upside down, their savings accounts were drained. They didn't have the same options that people do when the economy is doing well. So there was a couple who came in, my first couple that I did this with. One week they'd say they wanted to get a divorce. The next week they'd say, we want to stay. And they just kept going back and forth. And so I didn't know how to help them. And finally, one day it just occurred to me to say, can you actually do both? Can you build something out in your house? They were both doctors, so they did have some resources, not enough to split. But they had the resources to build a little, addition onto the house with a bedroom and a bathroom. And so they were able to somewhat physically separate, but they also both got to see the kids every single day, and they got to still do family vacations together. But there was an understanding that there would be no romance, and they were both fine with it. It does get tricky, and I'm sure you'll ask me about it later, when it's like, okay, how do you date and do this when you're living with your spouse? But I consider that advanced, so I do try to save that for later on.
Yeah, which is a good question. But all right, so in a parenting marriage, I guess the first question I have is, how long does this last? I mean, is this a forever thing or is it a temporary thing?
Well, there are couples who begin to do a parenting marriage and they may realize pretty quickly, I don't think we can do this. I've had one couple that said, if we're going to work this hard, we're going to work on our marriage. So they ended up staying in their traditional marriage. I've had other couples who say it's just too difficult. But I always think it's worth giving it a shot because you have absolutely nothing to lose by trying this, except maybe a couple of months in the timeline. But basically, for most people, when they start a parenting marriage, their intention is to do it until the last kid has been launched and is off to college. But I have also had people who continued to live this way, even though their kids are grown. So there, you can do it for a year, you can do it for 5 years, 10 years. It really doesn't matter. It's up to the couple and what works for them.
Well, what would you suggest? So let's say a couple comes into you and says, okay, we want to give this a try. Would you suggest that they talk like that they make a temporary arrangement for, say, 6 months? Let's try this for 6 months, then come back and see how it's working, do a check-in. Or would you say to them, we should set a definite timeline, like it's going to end at this point, or leave it open-ended and just sort of go with the flow?
I love that question. It's not one that I can just say one or the other. And part of the reason is because every couple is different. Their needs are different. Their abilities are different. I actually rule people out of the parenting marriage because I don't want people to think this is just so easy and anyone can do it. If there is a lack of trust, if there's an active addiction, if there's an untreated mental illness, if there's domestic violence, those are some scenarios where I would not have that couple do a parenting marriage. That's much more complicated. So this concept is really for people who can come from their higher, more mature selves. They set aside their own needs temporarily in service of what's best for the kids. They can get along, they do get along, they share good enough parenting similarities so that they can do this. And then, I mean, ironically, when a couple's going to get divorced, they're sort of doing this by default anyway, if they're staying in the same house. And then there are also many couples who have been doing this for years by what I call default rather than by design. And so some couples can just slip right into it. Some really need to be guided through it. And, I just take it from there and I will make recommendations and the couple can do what they want with it.
Yeah,
Very flexible.
to me, what the beauty of this concept is that it's bringing out into the open things that people are doing anyway. They're doing it, to your point, unconsciously, or they're not, nobody's talking about it. But the couple hasn't, the spouses haven't been sleeping together for who knows how long. And they both want to do their own thing, but they don't want to get divorced because of the kids. And
Right.
so they're actually kind of in a parenting marriage by default. But from my perspective, it just seems to make so much more sense to do it with intention.
Well, what happens when people do it by default is they feel stuck. They feel like they're doing something wrong. They feel hopeless and like this arrangement's interminable. And so I've had people say, oh my God, you mean I can do this? I have permission. This is okay. And what it's done for people by just naming it, because again, I didn't come up with stay together for the kids. People have been doing that, but they've been suffering. And so this basically says, here's the framework, here's the language. And yes, you can do this on purpose and with intention.
This is brilliant. I think it's brilliant. So how do they do what framework? If somebody comes to you and says, okay, our relationship as a romantic relationship isn't working. We want to do this parenting marriage thing. How do we do it? What are the kinds of things they have to think about and talk about and agree on in order to make this work?
I think the first thing that they need to agree on is that they can put the needs of their children first. Another scenario that I've had is that parents think they can stay together, but they continue fighting. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that it's actually not divorce that harms kids, it's parents fighting that harms kids. So if parents are going to continue to fight, and when I say fight, I mean that there's palpable tension all the time, kids just don't have the defenses to deal with that. So it really impacts them negatively. So every couple is going to have a squabble or a disagreement. That's not what I'm referring to. It's really when there's a great deal of tension and some fighting as well. you're not going to do your kids any favors if that's the atmosphere that the kids are going to be raised in. So I want to make sure that they are going to get along and that they can co-parent well enough, we call it the good enough parenting, so that the kids feel safe and comfortable and like their parents are in charge, and the kids don't need parents to love each other, and they sure don't want to know if their parents are sleeping together, but they do want to know that they are loved and cared for. And so when parents get along and are being good parents and attentive to the kids, then kids feel secure. And that's really the biggest aspect of the parenting marriage.
But that brings up an interesting question. So the parents, let's say they're trying it, do they tell the kids? And if they do,
So
what do they
yeah,
say?
well, in my parenting marriage workbook, I'm also redoing that to have a second edition, because in the first edition, I said, here's the timeline, work backward from when you tell the kids. So you want to have the last summer vacation, get the kids back at school, all this stuff, and sort of like parents knowing that it's going to happen, and then tell the kids, we're going to be living a little differently now. But I have changed my mind about that. I think what works best is when parents actually start doing the parenting marriage. So they're not spending as much time together. They each may have their own separate time with the kids. They don't sleep in the same room anymore. And so after they have implemented those changes for a couple months, then say to the kids, have you noticed that things are different and that mom and dad are getting along better? And the kids usually notice because they're so perceptive. And so they can say, well, we've just decided that we're going to live a little bit more separately, and we'll still be here for you guys, but we are not spending as much time together. They don't ever have to tell the kids, but I do like for parents to say something so that kids understand that there is a difference and it's named and it's okay, versus what's going on, what's happening with my parents. So, you can tell your kids it's a parenting marriage. You can just say, we're doing something different. We're not spending as much time together. And I will say, because this may be another question you have, you can do the same for friends and family. You can just say, we're not spending as much time together. We get along better when we don't see each other as much. So whatever you want to say, when people say we're doing a parenting marriage, their friends and family will say, what are you doing? Because it's not mainstream quite yet. It's definitely
Right.
getting there. But you can tell people or not. People who don't know, again, that you haven't been sleeping with your spouse for years, don't need to know. You don't have to tell everyone. I don't want people to think that they must disclose this. So
Yeah.
it's the difference between privacy and secrecy.
Yeah, I understand completely. And when I'm coaching my clients as they're going through the process, I often tell them that they should, if they can, sit down together and craft what I call their press release, right? It's
Oh,
like
I love that.
the actors and the big shots and the famous people do. They'll put out a press release and it goes something like this. We have decided after much consideration to go our separate ways. We still respect each other and care for each other. Please respect our privacy during this difficult time, right? Something that shuts down the busybodies from asking questions that are not their business at
Right.
all.
Love
So
that.
I would think that something like that in the parenting marriage context, where they could sit down and have a set stated narrative that goes out, and as long as everybody sticks to the narrative, it potentially could work,
I
I would
love
think.
that. That's a great idea. Yeah. But again, I don't think everyone needs to know that it has a name. You can just be informal about it and say it's just, we're just not going
Yeah.
to spend as much time together. We're doing some different things to get along better.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, what happens when the kids, I mean, kids are inquisitive. What happens when they do notice and you haven't said anything yet because you're trying to implement, and they're like, Mom, why aren't you sleeping in the same room as Dad? Or Dad, how come you're gone so much? Or whatever the question is. How do parents respond then?
Well, if they're doing the parenting marriage by design, I
Hmm.
think they should tell the kids what's going on. And again, you can say it's a parenting marriage or we're just trying something different. But I think if a kid is noticing and bringing it, it's actually why I like when parents tell the kids first so they don't have to wonder and figure out what's going on. Just telling the kids ahead of time is great. And when I say ahead of time, after they ask you, not in advance of
Right.
doing the parenting marriage. Let me also say why I want people to do it first and then tell the kids versus the other way around. If you say, okay, kids, let's sit down, we're going to have a family talk and we're going to do a parenting marriage, and this is what it's going to look like. In my experience, kids can get anxious. If they're being told there's going to be a change,
Right.
they will get anxious versus putting the change into, action and then telling them, just by the way, this is what we've been doing. They don't have that. So they get to see that nothing's going to change in their world, which is their primary concern,
Right.
and that it's all okay, right? And everybody's in favor of it.
And does it matter how old the kids are? Like, do you say different? I would think you have to say different things to different kids at different times.
Absolutely. For older kids, obviously, uh, when parents aren't being sexual and intimate with each other. Again, kids don't really want to know, but you can just say, yeah, we're not sleeping in the same room anymore. We're okay with that. For younger kids, you might want to say something like, we're not kissing friends anymore, which would be some language that they would understand. And if they have questions, you just speak on the level that you think that they will be able to understand.
That makes so much sense. So, all right. So let's say a couple does this, um, and it doesn't work. Is there any value to having tried the parenting marriage?
Yes. What it can do is what one couple called a soft landing into divorce. A couple I had in Colorado did this arrangement, and the reason it didn't work is because of the dating thing. The woman got a boyfriend, but the guy, no one would believe that this was above board, and so he couldn't get into a new relationship. So they decided after 18 months to stop doing the parenting marriage and go ahead and get a divorce. Well, what they had already put into place was a custody agreement, a financial agreement. And so it was not very much of a leap into the divorce realm for them. So it definitely can make divorce easier and softer, if you will. And it also prepares the kids so that when there are two separate homes, it's not that big of a difference for the kids.
That makes so much sense. And it sounds similar to some of the work that I do in helping clients create trial separations, where
Yes,
what they're really doing is they're dealing with all of the issues that they're going to have to deal with if they get a divorce. And it doesn't mean that they're going to get a divorce or they're 100% going to go down that road. But while they're trying it out, they're also trying on different scenarios, different ways of living, different lifestyles, that then they can take with them into the divorce. And like you said, it's not that big of a leap then. It's not like you're
right,
going from everything is wonderful to we're getting a divorce tomorrow.
right, exactly. And the kids had no idea what was going on. So
Right.
yeah, yeah.
So, but what about you mentioned finances. Does a parenting marriage have different financial arrangements, or can it, or does it have to? How does that work?
Okay, well, that is completely up to the couple. Even when I'm dealing with couples who, just are dealing with minor marital issues, communication or things like that, there's what I suggest, what I consider a healthy way for couples to have their finances is that there's one joint account that if both are working, they can both contribute to on a pro rata basis. If only one's working, then that person can contribute and they figure something else out. But that each person has their own separate account that they're not accountable to the other parent, to other spouse, so that it's their fun money. They can do with it what they want. So I think that that's a great way for those who are in a parenting marriage to go, so that they begin their separation if they haven't already been doing that. And the other thing that I like about the parenting marriage, and this has to do with the finances, is people so often, I'm sure you see this all the time, they do what I call a knee-jerk divorce, where they say, okay, we haven't slept together in a year. I can't do this anymore. I'm out of here. I'm filing. But what they don't do is map it out, plan it out, and they surely don't save money for it. So what parents can be doing during this time is they can be putting money aside for divorce expenses, because as we know, it's incredibly expensive. So that you can map it out, do a 2-year plan if you can, to put aside enough money so that you're not going to be stressing out about having to use the kids' college fund for something that it's not intended for.
Right. That makes so much sense. And, another concept that I often talk to people about, and they look at me like I'm crazy, but it's like making a divorce budget, right? You sit down ahead of the game and you figure out, okay, I'm going to need this and this and this and this and this. And as long as you've got two reasonable people, which doesn't always happen, I get that, but you've got two reasonable people who say, we want to do this within this monetary amount. How can we do it? And you actually, as a couple, can work together to solve the problem of how do we divorce for a certain amount of money or within a certain amount of time or in a certain way.
I call it an IDA, an individualized divorce account, instead of
I
an
love that. I love that kind of, not like an Ira, an Ida.
Exactly.
Although that was my grandmother's name. I don't know if I could
Oh.
do that, but that's neither here nor there. So, okay, so we've talked about a lot of what goes on between
Yeah.
the spouses and the children. What about, and I know this is more my area than yours, but I'm going to ask you anyway about the legal aspects. Are there things that you recommend that a couple who wants to do a parenting marriage that they do legally to cement the deal, so to speak?
Sure. And unfortunately, a parenting marriage is not recognized by the law. So I've had clients go to an attorney and they say, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And so, because parenting marriage is an informal agreement with couples, most therapists and most attorneys haven't really heard of it. And so they might tell the person, maybe even shame the couple, that you shouldn't be doing that. That's not a marriage. But what couples can do is, I often recommend doing a post-nuptial agreement. And post-nups are best done when you're getting along well. So before you begin the divorce process, if you've already gotten everything laid out as it's going to be split up, you're gonna have the easiest divorce process, again, as long as both people are cooperating. And one of the things that can happen when people start the divorce process is, even mentally, they just go down into survival and
Hmm.
safety modes, right? And so they get scared and they get more grabby. So that can happen, which is another reason why, if you do the work to split your assets while you're on good terms and while you're feeling comfortable, you can always revisit it later if something does feel really out of whack. But doing it when you're both more, I'll just use the word sane, meaning just, grounded, right? And so they can make their agreements, get it, signed off by an attorney. Each person needs their own attorney, so each person will need an attorney. You can, I suppose, and maybe you can speak to this, get a document notarized. So that would be one step above just your own informal agreement.
Hmm.
So
It,
what do you think?
well, yeah, you can. It depends on the state. Some states recognize
Ah,
postnuptial agreements, others do not. And if you're in a
ah,
state that does not, it's just like, well, you got to deal with what you've got, right? But postnuptial agreements, to your point, should always be written 100,
mhm.
because people have different memories of what they agreed to, or they think they agreed because they're each one is agreeing in their head to what they think is being said, but it's not what is being said. So
Right,
putting it in writing forces both people to read it and say, yes, this is what I agreed to, or no, this isn't it. Let's keep talking, right? And
right.
so it should be in writing and contain whatever that state's laws requirements are to be enforceable. If they require a notary, you need a notary. If it's just two signatures, then fine, but you definitely need two attorneys.
Well, and what's funny about what you're saying, you're reminding me, people say, I don't want to get a postnup. And basically, I read this in an article once that everybody has a postnup and it's called state law. So, right, the way things are split up is going to be either up to you or up to the state, but you have a postnup. So you might as well have one on your terms.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great saying. I think I'm going to steal that one. Um,
Absolutely, I did.
but that reminds me, all right, so you can see in the post-nup situation, you need lawyers because this is not, this is technical, it's tricky, and if the post-nup isn't done correctly, it's useless, right?
Right.
So I can see the value of having professionals in that scenario. What about the value of having a professional in the parenting marriage? Like when people do this, do they also agree to stay on with a therapist and do check-ins? How does that work?
Well, a lot of the clients that I've had have stayed with me for the first few months until they feel like they really have it down and they've worked out some of the kinks. If there's a therapist who is parenting marriage friendly, and I'm teaching more and more therapists across the world, and so I've got this great referral network now. But if they know about parenting marriage, they can walk a couple through. If they don't know about it, my concern is that they may either shame the couple or not fully help them to get it down. So I just encourage, if there are any therapists listening to this podcast, that you get familiar with what the parenting marriage concept is, and either download the workbook or take one of my classes, or somehow I've written a bunch of articles on Psychology Today. So there are lots of ways to get the information. But I just think
Yeah.
that the more therapists know about whether it's a parenting marriage or even whether it's about divorce, the better they're going to be able to guide a couple. I joke with my therapist students that I say, how many of you have ever had a class on divorce? Undergraduate, no hands go up. Graduate, almost no hands ever go up. So we don't get the education we need for one of the most destabilizing and common events that will ever come through our doors. So I really feel like therapists need to get better educated in order to walk, especially couples therapists, in order to walk their clients through any of these processes.
Well, that makes so much sense because I mean, in the time that I've been practicing law and working in the divorce space, which is, we'll just say a few decades, there have been tremendous changes.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first started, you just went to court, like both sides lawyered up, you went to court and you hope for the best. I was one of the first lawyers in Chicago to actually get certified as a mediator and to try to work in mediation. That was new back then. Now
Mhm.
mediation is old hat. And it's like anything, as you see all these changes happen, you realize that the quality of the service that a professional can provide depends on the training they've gotten. And
Exactly.
you may think you're able to do this, but you don't really know what you're doing unless you get properly trained, in my opinion.
And I didn't know. I kind of had to learn on the job. So that's how we either learn on the job, or therapists use their own life experience, which can be fine, but it can also be messy, right? If you're projecting onto your clients what your experience was. So it is good to just get as educated as possible.
So what if let's direct the conversation to the consumer. Do you think it's like a fair question for a client to come into a therapist and say, "Hey, have you been trained in this?"
Oh, absolutely. For any professional that you're working with. And that's one of the things that I don't want to divert too much, but when clients are telling me that they want to get an attorney, I guide them to say, ask them what they specialize in. You've got this particular issue, ask them what they know about it. Because every professional is different, both what their knowledge base is, what their personality is, how experienced they are. So those are really important questions.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for clients to know that whoever they're going to for help has the right training to help them in the way they want to be helped. Because I've seen that with people walking into lawyers' offices.
Mhm.
They think they're, a lot of lawyers, when collaborative divorce came out, a lot of lawyers would say, "Oh yeah, I'm collaborative." And they
Right.
were about as collaborative as an alligator. And they'd
Exactly.
never been trained and they wouldn't sign any of the agreements and they didn't know the process and the client didn't know. They just said, "Oh, they're collaborative. Okay." And then you've got
Yep.
a mess on your hands.
Exactly. Yep.
So it's the same kind of thing. So,
Mhm.
okay, steering us back to the parenting marriage. You mentioned in the conversation trust. How important is it that the two spouses can trust each other as parents? I mean, whether you're trusting them to have or not have an affair or what they're doing, different thing. But
Right.
how important is trust in this kind of a relationship?
Trust, a basic trust is vital. As you said, I mean, maybe one of the partners has been betrayed, and so they don't necessarily trust that their spouse is going to honor the agreement that they now have, that they're not going to date until they're more experienced with the parenting marriage. They, if they can just deal with their wound and their trauma in many cases on their own with their own therapist, so that they can trust that this person is going to be a good co-parent. That is fine. That's enough. And it can obviously get so tricky when there's been betrayal, or when it doesn't have to be with another person. It can be financial betrayal. It can be a skeleton that comes out of the closet that was never disclosed. I mean, there's so many ways that people can withhold information or feel betrayed. So it's very complicated in terms of the spouse relationship, but to be able to distinguish the parent-child relationship, and so therefore the co-parent relationship. If you trust, and I hear this all the time, I do think that she is a good mom, I do think he's a good dad, whatever they think about them otherwise, they do have that confidence and trust that their counterpart is going to take good care of the kids. That's really important.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, otherwise, I don't think this would work on any level. But
Right.
when you put this in place, then does each parent get separate time with the children? Are you doing kind of almost like a parenting time schedule that would be done in divorce? Not to that level because you're all in the same house, so there are times you all see each other. But do you
Right.
say, okay, you dad, you get to be with the kids by yourself on these days, mom gets these days, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. That's usually what I recommend, because again, I think it provides that separation for each of the parents, and it helps them build better relationships with the kids without the other co-parent there. So I do think that that's a really good way to go.
And inside of the house, I'm just trying to think like how this might be different than bird nesting,
Okay.
where the parents come in and out. But in a parenting marriage, both parents, they may have separate bedrooms, but they're still in the same space, right?
Yes, they are. Yeah, and they can create separation in the house. Um, I had one couple in Canada who they put the kids upstairs in this giant, it was the master bedroom, but they made it into a giant bedroom slash playroom. And then each of the parents had their own separate bedroom downstairs from that. So they got separation that way. As I said, if there's an in-law unit or some way that there's some houses even have two masters. So there are ways that people can find that separation. I'm just remembering about a couple also who they have their night in the house with the kids. So the other parent has to actually leave. And so they have agreements around that. So you get to have time outside the house with the kids, but also inside the house, which is really important.
That's really fascinating. I would not have thought about that. and just
Well, they came up with that. I didn't think of that either.
but that makes total sense because everybody's in their own element then and relaxed, and that's a
Right.
different experience than let's go to the movies.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Wow, so interesting. I could talk to you for forever about this because it's such a fascinating concept. And I can see it helping so many parents. I mean, to your point, it's not right for everybody. There are certain people
Right.
that definitely should not go down this road. But for the people for whom this is a good solution, it's a brilliant solution. So
Oh,
if people
well,
are interested in doing this, how can they find you? How can they connect with you? How can they find therapists who you've trained?
people can find me on my parentingmarriage.com website. And my bigger umbrella website is called Changing Marriage, so people can find me there as well. They can go on psychologytoday.com and look for my column and find some articles there. And if anybody wants to email me, my email address is susan@changingmarriage.com.
Susan, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And I hope that you've at least, my hope with this is that it at least opens people's minds a little bit. Whether you want to do it or you don't want to do it, whether it's right for you or not right for you, at least if people understand that this is an option, it gives them choices.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
I appreciate it. And for those of you who are listening, all of this will be linked in the show notes. Links to Susan's books, to her website, to the, parenting marriage website. You'll find it all in there. Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate it.
And for those of you out there listening, if you enjoyed today's episode, if you want to hear more things just like this, then do me a big favor, like the podcast, like the YouTube videos, subscribe in both places, and I look forward to talking with you again next time.